Go. Perfect. Okay, I believe everything is set up. I'm going to share a quick story to announce that I feel like the absolute millennial now, sharing a life story about a life that is happening. I'll try to be as quick. Can you hear us, by the way? Yeah?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, cool. Let me quickly announce that we're finally going live. We have a bit of a delay in here. I can hear the last minute of me speaking. So, okay, perfect. Martin, we have a delay here. So I said this 30 seconds ago, and then it comes back. Turn. Sorry, Apollonia. Almost starting. Just starting on.
We're not live yet, are we? We're live. We're live.
Okay.
With the little technical issue. I don't hear. Do we have an echo? Yeah.
Are you on the phone? For those who have already joined, we're just a couple minutes away. We're just starting. We're just sorting out one last technical issue.
No worries.
But yeah. Okay. Cool. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna share a quick story with you in the background. Hi everyone, I'm super excited to finally go live with none other than Apollonia Pralén. She's already here with us, here in the background. Hi. I'm just, in case you're wondering why we're in this space, this is a converted shipping container that is used for our live streams here at Terra Madre in Turin. And yeah, today we're speaking with Apollonia from the bakery, from the one and only bakery, Pralén. So I'm super excited to talk to her about what regeneration means to her at the bakery. Join us on this link and see you there. Again, I really quickly have to share that and then we'll finally kick this off. 1 second. Perfect. Okay. Well, we made it. So welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in. I say welcome. You're in Paris. I'm in Turin at Terra Madre. Tell us, so let me introduce you. I think no introduction is needed, but to those who are joining who might not know you yet, I'm sure many of them do. But you are, of course, the owner and third generation baker at Pralén in Paris. A bakery that has exceeded its reputation in Paris and has sort of captivated bread lovers all around the world. But you are also a graduate at Harvard in a degree of economics, and you are an author of the cookbook Pralén, The Secret of the World Famous Bread Bakery. There's so many things that I want to talk to you about, and seeing that we're at Terra Madre today, they are around the focus of regeneration. A hashtag that sort of guides everything here at the event. Obviously very closely linked to regeneration and the whole movement happening in agriculture and in food in general. But maybe let's start at the beginning and sort of, I'm just looking at the screen in front of me here in this converted shipping container. It's a huge screen, and I see a lot of paintings on the wall. Whereabouts are you at the moment?
Okay, well then, first of all, thank you, Julius, for introducing me. And thank you for everyone that is listening, tuning in, or will join this morning or this afternoon rather. I am currently in Paris and I am in the back room of my bakery on 8 Rue du Cherche-Midi. So to position you, we're on the left bank of Paris, and some 90 years ago, my grandfather established his very first bakery here. And at the time, this was an area with lots of artists and craftsmen. And so he started exchanging bread for paintings with some of them. So a lot of the things you see behind me are from that period. So a lot of them also reflect a lot of the diet that was very bread centric at the time. There is this way a lithography that was printed in this area as well, because I was mentioning craftsmen. There is one of the oldest lithography prints in Montparnasse, which is the next door neighborhood. And then I'm going to twist my screen for a second, so just be warned for those who get car or motion sickness. This chandelier is what is brightening my space. This is a bread chandelier that we hung up about a year and a half ago, but it's actually been a tradition here since my father made a whole bedroom made out of bread for Salvador Dali.
Okay, I think explain what a bread chandelier is and a bedroom made out of bread.
Yeah, so throughout times, bread has been mainly a food for like just this very primary food, but actually there's also an element where bread has become an artistic medium, whether it was for celebrations. There's one in Sicily that every year where there's the creation of little bread figurines that are hung up, and then you have the impression that you're like in just the bread world. But there are also some places where out of necessity, bread became the medium for the artistic medium. But in the early 70s, my father received a commission by Salvador Dali that wanted to make a whole bedroom made out of bread. And since that day, we've made it a tradition at Poilâne that in the back room of our bakery, we are lit up by a bread chandelier. So a chandelier that is made of bread. Now, of course, we do make the electricity threads go through, and then you have the light bulbs and all, but this is a chandelier that's parts are not brass, are not wood, are not any other type of material. They're made out of bread.
It's speaking about that and just seeing the space here, and instantly it becomes clear what sort of legacy is attached to the bakery. And you know, the very space you are in breathes the evolution and sort of the importance of bread, which is so fantastic. I noticed a painting it's on your left, I think on the top. It looks very much like the bread that Poilâne is so well known for. Is that what the painter then sort of depicted? Yeah.
Yes. So most of the paintings behind me represent the bread that has become our iconic wheat sourdough bread, which I like to describe in the book you mentioned in the introduction as a big hug of wheat sourdough bread. Because if you extend your arms in front of you, you'll get about the volume of the loaf of bread. And that loaf was the loaf that the average French person ate until the early 20th century, when for the first time there were more people that were living in cities and in such a high concentration that we could afford to go to the bakery several times a day, because at the time an average French person ate between 600 to 900 grams of bread every day.
Wow, a lot has changed in our diet and perception of bread, which is, you know, I think we're gonna go into that later because there's so much to talk about there. I think so. I mentioned that you're a baker from the third generation. You mentioned your father. Maybe talk us a little bit around through the history of Poilâne when it started and to where you are now.
So Poilâne is a bread bakery that has a culture for bread and of bread. From its start, when my grandfather started in 1932, he connected with millers and with growers to source the best quality ingredients that would make for his bread. He used sourdough, which was a method that was coming out of fashion. And he was also using a wood-fired oven. Just think 100-ton heavy oven that is lit up with wood fire. So in some ways, our bakers are vessels, keeping that fire and that light up and going. There is, from the start, in the heart of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, where we are right now, we started developing a network of retailers. And what is my father taking over my family's business in the 70s, my grandfather had an accident. There was the idea that there would be how to preserve this handmade craft where the human hand's intelligence makes all the difference in sustaining a constant quality of bread, despite the season, despite the weather, despite your mood. And started developing both our stores and our retailers network. I took over a little under 20 years ago, and with my teams, we've been sustaining this, in some ways, what has been our mission, which is to nurture bodies and souls, but also nurturing the understanding of what is the value chain from grain, so therefore from soil. And I think, the title of our conference, Terra Madre, is very, very serendipitous to say that you can't just look at the grain, you also have to look at the soil in which that grain grows. And how do we rebuild that value chain in our bread eaters' mind?
It's one of the themes that pops up so much when you're here at Terra Madre. Walking around and speaking to all the producers, what instantly becomes apparent is how much passion they have for their products, but how much that passion goes far beyond the product, to the growers, to the soil, and to where everything stems from, and how important it is to actually look after the soil first, to grow proper ingredients, to then make whatever the product is. And you mentioned, so in your book that I mentioned earlier, Pralène, The Secret of the World Famous Bread Bakery, in the beginning you talk about the value of bread. And what I find so important here again at Terra Madre is that we don't only share the excitement for the product, but what's so important and what goes before that is really an education of the consumer to be open to learning more about it and to appreciate these products. So when you describe the value of bread in your book, what does that mean to you?
I think you're pointing out something that's super important, is that bread, in the words of Jonathan Swift, is the staff of life. And whereas we take it for granted because it's available all over the place at all kinds of different price points, and whether it's super cheap looking or super fancy looking, it's something that looks like it's commonly available. But actually, what we don't realize is the complexity of the value chain that's in there. When you have a loaf of bread, it's about 6 hours of work. Like that loaf that's featured on these paintings behind me takes 6 hours from start to the baking finish point to produce. And then, it's the work of the miller that grounds the grain that will eventually make the flour of whatever grain you're making. And how do you keep that grain sane for a year, since we only harvest once a year? And before that, it's how the growers select different grains, test them, develop the volume of grains necessary to eventually, on year 3, grow the wheat that is necessary, or the rye that's necessary for that year's harvest. And when you have all that value chain in your mind, you just cannot look at a loaf of bread in the same way. And so in part, in my book, what I am trying to share is both that knowledge, but these reference points, and also offer ways in which, from crust to crumb, from day 1 where the bread is at its freshest to day X when it's at its stalest, that you can make the most out of the piece of bread. Because when you have all these things in mind, you cannot bring yourself to wasting a piece of bread.
You mentioned the value chain. Let's maybe go to the beginning of that, the very beginning of that chain. Is that soil? Is that where does it start?
Yes, And Julius, you and I had a little talk before this call today, and the two of us talked about how we often look at the ingredients that we put in the bread. So that's the wheat flour or whatever grain flour we are using, but we often forget that that grain needs to be sowed in a beautiful soil. So the importance of what is the kind of soil in which the grain that we are harvesting comes from, because obviously a dead soil will not give the same nutrients as a more live soil. It won't provide the same things. And for me, that is something that I think was very clear and apparent when next to my manufacture. So here right now, under where I am, there's the bake house where we produce all the breads, cookies, and pastries that are sold in the store. And then we have a round shaped building outside of Paris where there are 24 ovens, just like the one you see downstairs, where we have as many bakers that work around the clock to deliver our retailers. And what's extraordinary with that space is that it's 24 ovens that operate like they were single bakeries, one next to the other. But my point is, my parents chose a very specific space to implement and to build this building. My father as a baker and my mom as the designer and architect of that place. And they chose a space that's between a wood, which is one of our core ingredients to heat up the wood-fired ovens, but also a field that growing up, I always saw alternate between wheat, corn, and just, in French, we say a jachère, so just letting it rest for a year.
Yeah.
And then 2 years in a row, some 15 years ago, I saw that there wasn't any wheat or another grain growing. And so what I was like, we need to find a way to make this soil like just be carried on being nurtured and carry on being like worked. And what was interesting was at the time I was also starting to experiment with different grains and how we can, what are the different crop associations that we can create. The point is, this all came at a time where there was sort of like a cluster of these different effects, like that made me realize what seems very obvious to me needs to be brought to people's eye and interest so that they can value what they have on a daily basis in their hands and mouths.
So you mentioned different grains are grown and used for the bread. Is that something? So do you work with a collection of farmers that look at? Yeah.
So I think the first thing, Julius, is that we often are very imprecise in our language. We often use the word flour in a very generic matter to mean wheat flour. And I'd like to redefine people's standard. And it will take an effort and it will take time. But think of it, when you use the word flour, what is the grain you're referring to? And if you're not referring to a grain, by the way, plaster makers do or use stone flour. So really, flour is not an end in and of itself, or is not a product in and of itself, but rather it's a technique that grants a certain texture of something. And so from that starting point, I've come to conceive of my craft as that crossroads between grains and fermentation. And so forget all of the fancy language or all of the more intellectual thoughts behind it, but just think about this. What is the grain that you're using to make your bread? And so to answer more directly to your question, my grandfather, my father, and now me with the millers and growers work year by year, season after season, on what is the blend of grains that we work with to find the best choice of grains for that year. Because according to the weather, the season, and the type of soil you're using, you're not going to be able to use the same grains because you have to greet the quality of the soil and the environment that year.
I think a lot of people, to no fault of their own, look at bread and think it's always made from exactly the same grain of flour. I think we often look at wheat as just one plant,
Yeah.
but I think what's really beautiful, and I think what Teramato does such a wonderful job at sharing, is that nature sort of expresses what can be grown that specific year, like you just said. What then strikes me a lot is whenever
Sorry to
something...
interrupt you, Julius, but I think
Yeah.
a very simple way of planting that seed of a thought in people's mind is you don't dress the same way year round unless you live in an area where the climate is so stable that that is literally the best way of going about it. Now, if you think about that this way, maybe that can give you some insight into the idea that no, you can't be growing the same thing year to year in the same soil, because it just doesn't work that way, because there are so many other moving parts to it. Sorry to interrupt. I just thought
No,
about
no,
it.
of course. I think that actually leads to another question, because do you ever see that affecting the flavor of the bread?
Yes.
So, yeah.
And so the question becomes, there's some certain breads where you want to greet those variabilities, and there are others where you don't. It all depends on what you're trading on or what you're offering to your clients. And so I agree, that's exactly right. Like, depending on the year, there are certain grains that will give their best, and others years where it's other varieties. And then the question becomes, what are the varieties that you want to use? And there's no good or bad answer. It's just about fine-tuning and finding the right way of getting to your goal, being clear about your goal, and then reverse engineering from there, basically.
Whenever a product is upscaled to a certain degree, things become faster, things need to be more consistent, so that it sort of becomes more industrialized. You do work on quite a large scale. You supply a lot of bread to Paris. You supply bread internationally. You have a bakery in London as well. How are you able to, first of all, communicate to the consumer that bread is not always the same? Because I think a lot of consumers do want that consistency. So,
Yeah.
that's one question. And then the second question is, how do you sort of have a level of consistency that you are happy with, that you can guarantee on a scale?
So I think part of the answer is in the way you're presenting things. There's a difference between something being the same and something being consistent. When you say that something is consistent, what you're saying is that it fits within the same framework, and you accept that there's little variability and that that's part of the game. Now, when you want it to be the exact same, then you want a product that doesn't react in any possible way to the environment, to the season, whatnot. So I think part of it is that, and part of the way that we greet the varieties in the ways that our grains interact with the weather, the season, and so on and so forth, is our human hands. These 10 digits that help feel and adjust so that we can fit within that frame. And that is something that's really beautiful, because our hands are extremely sophisticated in feeling, and their action, their potential to then be able to act on the dough and to adjust is also just as good, because it's that sophisticated.
So a large responsibility comes to the baker, obviously, with handling that bread, and to be always able to deliver no matter what grain is being used that year.
That's exactly right. And I think that's a testimony as to the intelligence of bakers that manage to be consistent, which is that they manage to be within a certain range of similarity, so that our clients are not disappointed, and yet accepting that from one day to the next, we are adapting.
I think that's the beauty of manufacturing, making it
Exactly
with the hands.
Well, and that's why my parents
so
used the word manufacture to describe the place where we have 24 ovens, is they wanted to valorize the intervention of the human hand.
And the moment you introduce a machine, it becomes not the question is, can the machine handle the grain, but how can we adjust the grain for the machine?
Well, and that's where I would put my limit. Is like, for me, any technological advancement needs to like do something that betters the situation, and it's not just about us adapting to the machine. And I understand that's a broad statement, but I think oftentimes, like for me at Poilâne, the spirit that my father called retro innovation was saying about using the best of past techniques and understanding where we come from to nurture the best response to today. And that means sometimes doing things in a way that has been ancestral, and it's in that way time proven. And in other ways, or in other instances, realizing actually our bread or this product or this machine can facilitate the work and create for the same quality of bread, and it facilitates the baking. I'll give you one very simple example. Le pétrin, the mixing bowl. Now, before we had these mechanical mixing bowls, which in the story of baking is about 100 years old, which is compared to the millenniums that we've been baking bread is not that much. But that mixing bowl has changed the surface of how we bake bread, because now instead of having two people that's job was simply to just mix the dough in a very hardiest way, now we have a machine that can do it and be, in some instances, more respectful of the dough than the human hand. And that's incredible. And so that's where, when I was telling you about retro innovation, this is retro innovation in action. It's a new technique that betters where we come from. And what is important as a starting point for baking bread is mixing the ingredients to make the bread dough.
It's one of my later questions would have been about sort of contemporary baking, but I think you already touched on that now. And if I sort of summarize or try to summarize what you just said, it's about not rejecting new technologies, not rejecting innovation as, we have to do everything how it's been done in the past because that's the proper way of doing it. But it's sort of learning from traditional culture and history and seeing how can we work together with, innovation and technology to bring the two to a contemporary approach of baking. Is that sort of fair?
That's completely fair. What I was going to add is also understanding why we did it in that way. I really believe in time-proven methods and techniques to help you go forward. And I say this because oftentimes you will hear people say, oh, we're going to do it the old-fashioned way or the traditional way. And I'm not really sure what people put behind those words, but the assumption that because it was done that way previously means it's the good way is it's oversimplifying, and that in some ways is setting the standard that nothing good can come from the future. And yet we live in a world where we've advanced so much in our understanding of agriculture, of technologies, that wouldn't we want to integrate whatever amazing new understandings that we have from our present times?
So if we go back to the soil and regeneration,
Yes.
what does that mean in terms of, for that part of the process? Is there any sort of exciting new technology that we can learn from, or what do we learn from the past that we're applying today again?
Yeah. So one thing that in preparing our talk today, I know, Julius, you and I got so excited about talking about grains and the soil because we often stop at the grains because, of course, that's the thing that we can relate to the most. We all have a bag of flour in our houses, but actually, what is the soil in which that grain was grown? And that terrain is not only the space where you have eventually your bag of flour, but it's the bag of flours to come. Whether it's grain or plants or whatever it is, I think that one of the things that we're seeing is these crossing different crops and putting them together in ways. I'll give you the very simple milpa example with corn, where if you grow it with squash and with beans, then each of them work together to create a system that nurtures the soil. Well, similarly, whereas 50, 70 years ago, we needed to feed a growing number of humans on this planet, now we're at a point where we understand better that this extensive planting in agriculture is detrimental to the quality of the soil, and we need to rethink about what are the different aspects. So for example, one thing that's been happening is using cover crops to prepare the soil and protect it for future growth. And this is not something that's been new. Like, I know that that for a lot of us, this is a hot topic, but I've heard growers talk about this for years and years because they literally don't have a choice than to try and find the most simple and effective ways to nurture their soil because it's their terrain. Think of it like their running shoes to do a marathon. And if they don't have good protection, if they don't have a good soil, then they're not going to be able to do a crop in the years to come. So that's the crossing of different ingredients in the field is one thing, but then also different varieties in the same field. And that's traditionally, or at least in the past 50 to 70 years, we've seen a lot of single variety fields, and now more and more, there is the idea that, well, actually, it's interesting to mix different grain varieties within the same field because they go and take different things from the soil, which means they don't use up the soil's energy in the same way.
It's one of what you just mentioned with the, I know that I heard about it as the Three Sisters method of growing, when you grow a squash, exactly. It's just so fascinating to those who are listening because I can't recall it exactly, but also with the cover crops and growing legumes on the same field. Let's say wheat, wheat drains the soil from nitrogen, and growing legumes restores that nitrogen naturally, whereas in other, we say conventional farming methods, we use a fertilizer to restore that. So I think what you mentioned is so powerful that there is a way in the past, but also in the present, where we now, maybe in the past we have done it with a less scientific background, but we've done it. And today we have that scientific understanding to actually realize, okay, this is what's taken from the soil. So let's go back and learn from the past, but with a new knowledge.
100%. And I think what you're pointing out nails exactly the tension between past and present. What you're saying is, because we now have the understanding, we can better revisit traditions and understand why they made sense. And while people of the previous generations might not have understood where they came from, now we understand why they were good or they are good and why they could be part of the solutions of how do we nurture a healthy soil and how do we make sure that we have that in some ways that we maximize the yield of our crops in a way that doesn't sound as straightforward at first, because we're saying we're actually mixing, so we're complexifying the system at first.
So once we leave the field, we've grown the wheat, we have the grain. What is the next step of the process that you then that is part of that chain that you were talking about?
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing is nurturing and I just want to backtrack for a second for two things. One is saying, yes, we need to nurture the soil. That is, we have a soil that we shouldn't overly work on to make sure that all of the lower, and these are not that deep, layers of the earth are not exposed in an unnecessary way. So you grow different grains, and we're giving the example of wheat here, but it could be rye, it could be corn, whatever it is. So we have the grain, we grow it, and we harvest it. And now we have a year's worth of supply. And so the question becomes, what do we do with it? And we're not going to bake bread at once for the whole year. So the next thing we need to do is make sure that we keep that grain safe and sane for consumption. And these are two very important conceptions, because they explain a lot of how cities were developed. And I'm referring here to Caroline Steele's book. The latest one is Citopia, but she explains and contends that cities were built in part because at some point you needed to protect the grain. So that is, you have your harvest, you're sitting on this pack of grain, the golds, your foods, the treasure for a whole year. Now, there are two things that can happen to it. Someone can steal it, and make it their food. So how do you protect it against theft or someone taking it from you, depossessing you? So that's where you create silos. That's where you create cities eventually to create an ecosystem to protect the grain. And then the other thing that can happen is that that grain can go bad, because if it's not kept in the proper way, then can go bad. So that's humidity, that is any types of pests that can come into it. So that's the second part. And that's often the one that's overlooked between the grower and the miller, because in between, there is a year worth of time that can go by between the moment where the grain has been harvested and the moment when it's milled. And so that's the second stage. Then we get to the third stage, which is the milling. And in milling, there are many different techniques. So the one that I prefer is this stone ground technique, where the whole grain is stone ground at once, and we squeeze out of it any exterior little coats that will that we want to remove. But we can then have a method that doesn't heat up the grain, such that it retains its natural oil. So that is amazing, because it's an old technique that about 100 years ago went out of fashion, and now people are going back to it because they're realizing that what it brought to the system. But those natural oils make for a flour, whether it's of wheat, rye, or whatever grain you're using, that has more of the whole thing. And therefore you don't need to add stuff, nasties or additions to the flour, because you have it all there. And then from that, you go to the bakehouse, where you can bake the bread that, if properly baked, and if you have the right volume, you can keep for several days and share.
You mentioned something that is so ironic, and that Michael Pollan talks about in his book and his documentaries and his work, is that we stripped flour and grain from all its nutrients,
Yeah,
and then we put them back in afterwards as an additive. And it's so ironic, isn't it?
it's
Um,
ironic.
So maybe you can just touch on that again when you said you're stone milling or you're stone grinding your flour. Why is that so important from the grain's perspective? What is left compared to maybe methods that remove more?
So I'd say that, bear in mind that all of these jobs and processes take a lot of human labor, and when technologies came in, people tested and tried different ways of milling the grain, anything that could basically help them get a higher yield with less humans involved. And it's a natural course of how can we do more with less. And sometimes it's about finding the fine tuning and adjusting what that really means. And so in the case of stone ground flour, we at Poilâne have been using for 90 years stone ground flour, because it takes the whole grain and it squishes it, and we exclude only the outer coats. So we can really have whatever that grain has to give. And what's beautiful is that it's there. You don't have to add anything into it afterwards. And what's more is that, because that's done in a very respectful manner, it also allows for the grain to retain its natural oil, which makes up for the souplesse and it just creates for the grain to be just more supple in the way it works. So you don't have to add anything, whether it's additives or even water or say some butter or oil, whatever you might be tempted to use to compensate that.
And it has a shelf life, doesn't it? Because I think once you mill it, people aren't aware that flour has a shelf life. It goes off
Yeah.
if it's treated the right way.
That's exactly right. And I think it's a little similar to spices. It never goes bad really. And even if it has a few little bugs in it, you can just sift them out. But the main thing is, yes, these ingredients eventually lose their freshness. Or like coffee. If you have a freshly ground coffee, it smells rich, it feels like nice and greasy and beautiful. Whereas if that grain has been ground 6 months or a year but prior, then obviously it'll have time to be exposed to the air and will have simply dried out. And if there's humidity, it might even have molded. And those are all considerations that that you see, and I think are important to bear in mind, and which might explain some traditions like the Jewish tradition before Easter to remove all of those ingredients from your home to greet new ones. It's in some ways, I can't help but think that there's a conception that, or an understanding, however empirical it may be, that there's something there to be checked and appreciate that it has a life cycle.
Yeah. I just looked at the time and I get carried away so quickly. We have barely left the mill and the milling process, but we're already.
I will interrupt you because there's one other example. And I'm just going to
Yeah.
show this again because there might be some people
of
who
course.
are tuned in. But this bread chandelier that we have in the back room and it lights up, I'm pausing on it for a few seconds because it has different shapes and forms. And if you come back in a couple of months or in a couple of years, it'll be a different chandelier because however long lasting it is a material that reacts to its environment. So yes, our bread keeps. Yes, this bread chandelier has been there for a year and a half. It will not be there in 3 years and it'll be a new one. And you have to accept this cycle. And it's beautiful because we're talking about the regeneration. Nothing, if there's one thing that we can be certain about, is that nothing is constant.
What's so wonderful speaking to you is that I find your approach to bread and everything around it so holistic. Speaking to you, you know exactly what's going on in the soil, you know exactly what's going on in the ovens, you know how to shape the bread yourself, you know how your bakers do it. And I think that's what I would always love to convey to everyone listening, is that when you go and support somebody who really supports a craft, like everybody at Terra Madre is in some form supporting a craft of growing something, of making something, you're supporting not only that person, but also all of that legacy and, of what's behind it and what's at stake. And, with you, there are so many people working to accomplish exactly that. I hope, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's, and for me, well, it's part of this culture of bread that my father really realized that bread is connected to just about anything. And that's something that he loved and shared and that definitely was contagious. But I think it's also a way, as you step into the world and go and ask questions, to know a little more and distinguish between qualities of ingredients and makers, because people who are passionate will have that attention to detail. And they may not know all of the answers. I certainly don't, but I have that curiosity. So have that curiosity, nurture that terrain.
I think that's a really wonderful point to end on, because curiosity, exactly, that's where it starts. If you're curious enough, we're gonna try new foods. We're gonna take that little bit more time to try something new, to experience, to experiment. And I think that's when it starts, when the process or the whole journey begins for somebody to support the right kinds of food and create a more sustainable world. Ultimately, a world of food. Thank you so much for your time. It was really lovely speaking to you. There's so much more to talk about. Hopefully we can pick this up at another time, but I don't want to keep you too long now. Is there anything you would still like to sort of share, anything that you're working on at the moment or that's important to you?
Yeah, so there's two things. First of all, thank you Julius, for leading this conversation, for taking the time to prepare, because the two of us are passionate people, and I know that we were worried that we might go all over the place, and so I think it's good that the two of us had this structure to focus. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in and listening to our babbling, our passionate selves. I think that the two of us, hopefully I'm not crossing boundaries here and suggesting that curiosity can be a great tool ongoing for each of us listening, and that includes myself. But you were asking me about what's next, what are things that keep me going, and I'll just share with you one little insight. Is there's this stage of baking where we take the bread out of the oven and we let the dough rest on a rack. And we don't let it rest on a rack just because it's too hot to handle by hands. The bread crackles and loses yet a little more water. And so there's part of me that wants to understand right now, what is the importance of this overlooked stage of baking bread? Something that we just take for granted, don't even look about. It doesn't even count in most of people's minds when they say baking bread. But I want to look more into it, the same way that I'm interested in different crops or in more esoteric effects of, say, the moon on, of course, the soil, but also on bread baking, since we use water.
It's your passion for the topic shines through so much, and you're a person who's been surrounded by home baked bread or by artisanally baked bread, but you're never ending curiosity is so powerful, which is such a wonderful thing to share. So thank you. You sort of inspire me because I have a sourdough starter at home. You inspire me to get that going again on a regular basis and be way more active, of course, in a very humble way compared to Pauline. But I think that's, again, something that's important to share is that, whatever you do at home, it sort of has an impact as well, and it will make you more passionate about how you appreciate the food you buy as well. So if you bake your own bread once, instantly you will look differently at the bread you buy, because you know the effort that's involved and what it takes. But again, I'm rambling on. And
no, that's a really important point to point out, and I think that nails it. It's like when you know where things come from, you can't look at them in the same way.
That sums it up. Perfect. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful time.
Thank you.
I'll see you again soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Bye.
Still in a live stream, but we can high five.
Oh, we're still live. Okay, we're still live. I don't know.
Thank you, Bologna.
I'm virtually high-fiving you.
Thank you, Zoom. Thank you, YouTube. Thank you
Yeah,
very much.
perfect. Thank you everyone for tuning in. And there's more live streams coming today and tomorrow. So stay tuned for what's still in the program. Have a look online.
Yeah.
Am I just looking up?
Actually, I don't know if we're still live streaming, but
Okay. Thank you, Apollonia. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you soon. Stay in touch.
see you. Yeah.
Great.
Wow.
I know.
There we are.
Can
Hold
we
on.
just take a photo of
I'll
that?
take a picture, yeah. I'm actually gonna post this as I can't take a picture.
Yeah. Oh God, this format is so addictive.
Yeah.
Let's take a picture.
You have a picture, you take a picture.
How is that pose? I love that I have my hotel notes here. It's like,
Also,
it's the hotel. I remember this morning.
where do I live?
Are we still live?
We're live?
No, we're not.
No, we're not live.
Who's that?
This is Ed.
Nice.
What? There you go.
Oh.